And welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the monastery, the open bar of the internet, the world's greatest shit show, and the place where we, the good brothers and sisters of this most holy of temples, seek enlightenment through the drunkest, craziest, and most batshit ways possible. I am your one and only gaming monk, better known as Mildra, and with me I have a newcomer into the temple, creator of the Volition RPG, the one and only Chris Maheu the second, also known as Tears and Fear over on Blue Sky. How you doing today, man?
I'm doing pretty well. How about you?
I am doing well. It is still stay the hell inside kind of weather because the highest that it got to was 0 degrees.
Yeah, we had a snowstorm come through today, and the last time it snowed here was 16 years ago. So basically the entire city shut down.
In panic mode, I'm guessing.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, that tracks. I've seen what happens when folks in the south get 1 inch of snow, and then everyone acts like the apocalypse is happening.
Yeah, and I lived in the Midwest for about 4 years or so, so I know what to expect. And definitely staying inside was the right move for today, and not getting on the road.
Oh yeah. So, I suppose I'll start with the humble beginnings, in a sense. Walk me through your first introduction to role-playing games and what made it stick.
Yeah, so in college, I was a big fan of Brandon Sanderson's books, particularly the Mistborn series. And I happened to find out about the Mistborn Adventure game, which was a TTRPG based on his novels. And I'm like, oh, this is cool. It seems really interesting. So I bought the book, read all the rules, and then convinced a few of my friends to play it. And we did a 6-month campaign in that system, and I basically did everything you're not supposed to do as a GM. I railroaded super hard. I had DM and PCs, and at one point one of my players is like, hey, this story is cool and all, but he was just like, wasn't really having a great time. And I'm like, okay. And I kind of felt bad about it. And then we kind of stopped. And then about a year later, another friend invited me to a 5th edition campaign, which I joined as a player, and he showed me how to actually run a game and make it fun for your players, and help them tell a story with you, and things like that. And so with that example, I dove right into the TTRPG community, trying out different games, watching videos to improve my own GMing skills, and have run a lot of campaigns since then. One of the most interesting experiences for me was I was at a period of time where I was at a job that they didn't really have much work for me to do, so I kind of had a lot of time to kill.
Mm-hmm.
And I kind of got involved with the Star Wars 5th edition community, and they mentioned that they wanted to put together a website for their system. And so I'm like, hey, I'm a programmer, I know how to make websites. And so me and somebody else started kind of like a year-long project of making a website for that system. And it was a really interesting look at TTRPG design, because that system is basically Dungeons and Dragons 5th edition, but adapted for Star Wars by some fans. So I basically had to take a system that I knew pretty well, but like figure out how to make the computer manage it and make the character builder and keep track of everything. And it was pretty crazy writing out all the logic for if you multi-class between different classes with certain numbers of superiority dice, how to calculate the number of superiority dice the character is supposed to have, or different types of spell slots, or all that kind of stuff. And dealing with it from the code perspective kind of just got me frustrated with like, oh, this system could just be so much simpler if you do X, Y, and Z and different ideas. And through that kind of thought process of how would I make this system just easier to use both for a computer and a person, and what are the things that I can learn from that to make a TTRPG that runs smoother and more easily. And that's kind of what led me to creating my own with Volition.
I can certainly get that. Now, with that in mind, what led to the chain of events that led to you creating Volition?
Yeah, so I part of it was kind of what I just said about wanting I sort of had this concept of a TTRPG designed to be used with a website, and a website designed for that TTRPG so that they didn't like step on each other's toes, and you could add features to the website to do things that no other TTRPG had really done before because it was baked into the system. That was one side of it. The other side was I had my friend who was a really good GM who kind of introduced me to D&D. He likes to run lots of different genres and worlds and settings, but he was really only familiar with D&D 5th edition, and so he would kind of take that and hack it in different ways. And you know, if we were doing post-apocalyptic, he came up with like cybernetics rules and things like that, and they were cool, but I could tell that his passion was more in the storytelling and narrative and he was just kind of like putting numbers together to get something to work, but the gameplay kind of felt off. But his storytelling was so great that it kind of still made it fun for everyone. So I also started to think about, like, if I made a system for this case where it could handle different sorts of genres and settings, what would that look like? And I've seen plenty of those out there, and I've like tried a few different ones. But I think Volition has a few things that makes it kind of unique and set apart, besides just the website that it offers.
Yeah. So, given that, when it comes to the site itself, was it a case where you guys had built a core book and then converted it to the site, or were you building the site and the rules at the same time?
Yeah, so the way it kind of started is I just had a Google Doc where I kind of wrote out the rules. But I always knew that long term I wanted there to be a website. It just was a matter of investing the time in building the site and figuring out how it all worked together. But even in the first version, I had a Google Doc with the rules on how to play, but all the character options and choices you could make were in a spreadsheet and managed like data, which is not the easiest form, but that was just the early version of it. And so once I got the website up and running, I was able to just import that spreadsheet of data into the website with all the information the website needed to manage everything. And that was pretty early on in the process. I've had the website running for about a year and a half now. And a lot of the development of the TTRPG has happened since then. So it's been most of it has been in tandem with each other. And to kind of give you a good example of one of the ways that's been beneficial is recently I've been working on how to determine encounter balance, which is one of the hardest things to do in a lot of TTRPGs. So on one hand, I've been looking at, like, how much damage do different players and NPCs do each turn, and using that to calculate some numbers to get a sense of what's balanced and what's not. But at the same time, I also added a feature to the website to do all those calculations for you and do them in real time based on the health of the people in an encounter. And so that gives you this ability where if you're running an encounter and you realize, oh shoot, the players just had a bunch of bad rolls, and now the balance tracker is saying that it went from being medium to deadly, I need to start pulling my punches a little bit if this is not a moment where you want it to be deadly. Or the inverse, where the combat is getting a little bit easier than you expected because they keep rolling really high. You can say, all right, I need to have some more enemies show up, and because this is supposed to be a dramatic, epic battle.
Yeah.
And then having the website do those calculations automatically made it easier for me to do the rules writing side. So it's like both the how to play as well as the website functionality really tied in together really well to make what I think is a cool feature to use.
Now, I often talk about the notion of Appendix N on this show. The books, the games, the other media that served as inspiration for the design of Volition. What would you say would be some of the entries in that Appendix N for this game?
Yeah, so I like to think that there's 3 other TTRPGs that all inspired Volition, and I think it takes a pretty good chunk from each of them. So probably the first one is where I started was Dungeon World. So that's the PBTA version of D&D. And there are a lot of things I really liked about it. The idea that enemies don't roll, but players, if a player rolls to attack, there's a chance that they take damage as the enemy fights back in that same roll, and that helped combat move a little bit faster, which I really liked. But it had some things where the class structure was very restrictive, and the way it handled like ability scores and skill modifiers and stuff was not something I was a fan of. So Volition really started with me kind of hacking Dungeon World into something that was a little bit more flexible, with more options for character creation, as well as some better ways to manage stat generation. Then the second one that really inspired me is the Quest RPG, which a lot of people say is like the best RPG for new players because it's the simplest one I've seen out there. Whenever you do anything, you just roll a d20, no modifiers, and then there's a chart that just tells you based on what you roll whether you succeed or fail, or succeed with complication or critical success. And then besides that, there's a few abilities you can pick from, and that's pretty much the entire game. And so that showed me like, oh, I don't need a lot of the complicated stuff that other systems I played before. It's more just a matter of like, do you have a way to resolve situations with some dice? And then do you have cool things the players can do? And so starting on that, I defined those things for Volition, and then I'm like, okay, what else can I add to it? But I'm only going to add things that actually add value to the game. And then the third one that inspired me was the Cipher system, which is probably my favorite published system out there. But there's a few little things about it that just make it a little frustrating for me to run sometimes. I really liked how narrative the character choices are in that. And the way they do it in their system is you have an adjective, noun, and verb. And each of those you pick from a list of different options, and that's how you define your character. So it really you really get to focus on like what makes my character special. So that's something I wanted to capture in Volition. But what I didn't like about the Cipher system was how much resource management there is in it, and like whenever you activate abilities by spending what essentially is your health, which always felt kind of weird to me. So Volition basically resulted in me taking the things I like from those three systems and getting rid of the things I didn't like, and then adding a few other ideas of my own.
Yeah. Now,
yeah.
when it comes to the kind of style of fantasy that Volition is, do you consider it a universalist system? Do you consider it like modern fantasy? Where on that particular spectrum do you place Volition?
Yeah, so it's designed to cover the way I kind of pitch it is that it's for your world. So if you're designing your own world, I do my best to have all the talents and NPC abilities and things there to cover that. But it does assume that the players are supposed to be heroes, so it's not going to be the best for like a deep horror game, but that's certainly still something you could do with it. If you want to run a heist, don't play Volition, go play Blades in the Dark. But if you're doing a heroic story and you want one little arc to be a heist, Volition can handle that. And one of the ways I handle trying to support a lot of different genres is by putting a lot of the rules about different subsystems inside the player talents. So a lot of games will have rules for hacking, but I have a hacking talent, and all the rules for hacking are inside that talent. And if a player chooses that talent for their character, it explains what they need to do. And if nobody picks that talent, nobody has to worry about how it works. Same thing for driving vehicles, or cooking, or stuff like that.
Yeah, which I can get. And since you brought up hacking, that brings me to a elephant in the room when it comes to hacking. And I only say that because elephants are big and hard to ignore. A lot of times with hacking systems, there is a bad habit because of how in depth they end up being, that a hacking sequence during a game, especially with a lot of Cyberpunk games, ends up being this duet between the hacker and the GM. How do you address that within the hacking system that you have for Volition? Is it just a different type of action or something else?
Yeah, so whenever I write the different features and talents for Volition, I really try to focus on like what is the story that's being told, and like what is the player trying to do in this moment. And so the hacking is pretty straightforward. It's basically there's a as you level up the hacking talent, you unlock additional features to do different things. So like at level 1 hacking, you get an ability called ping, and it simply says interact with an electrical device and ask the narrator about the location, function, or number of any other electrical devices connected to this one, and they'll tell you about each one. The other devices can be connected via hardline or wireless networks. So, and that's marked as a minutes activity, which means it takes at least a couple minutes in game time to accomplish that. But there's no role involved. You're just kind of assumed to have the skill to accomplish that. Because if you didn't have the skill to accomplish that, you wouldn't have the hacking talent on your character. And then as you level up, you get abilities that let you ask questions about data on networks, to change the functionality of electrical devices, and then even breach a network, which gives you more advantages when interacting with it. And so a lot of these talent trees kind of build off of each other. So you start off with just a very basic couple of things you can do to get familiar with it, and then as you gain experience and level up with talent, you start getting more complex things you can do with it. And so a lot of other games, like you said, will have like very complex interactions with multiple dice rolls between the single player and the GM, and I just kind of skip past all that to focus on the story. Like, okay, you can't do everything, at least at level 1, but what's a couple of things that a hacker can do that shows off their talent in hacking and then lets them get some advantage, but get back to the kind of the story that we're telling about all of the heroes, not just that one player.
Mm-hmm. All right, I can certainly get that. Now, with that in mind, I did want to go into the core die system that you have. It seems to me that it's a case where any rolled action is a contested one, if I've got it right, though there is the option to have it be player only rolls.
Yeah. So the player rolls 2 dice, the talent die and the fortune die, and sometimes, but not always, the GM will roll a danger die. So it's not exactly contested because you're not comparing the player's dice to the GM dice like you are in some systems. Success is only dependent on the player's roll. And so this is the core dice system is something I've really put a lot of thought into because I want it to be quick and smooth, but also reflect what's happening in the narrative. Mm-hmm. So the talent die is the size of the die is dependent on your level in the talent, from a D4, which means you don't have a talent that applies to the situation, all the way up to a D20 at level 5. And yes, it does go from D12 at level 4 to D20 at level 5, which is intentional because level 5 is supposed to feel like near godlike power in whatever particular talent. And then the fortune die size depends on the number of advantages or disadvantages you have in a situation. And that can be from special abilities you have or things in the environment that help you out. Or just the difficulty of the task at hand. And so that gives the GM some say about what the narrative is doing to make this roll easier or harder. So the player just rolls those 2 dice, and as long as one of them is 4 or higher, they succeed on what they were trying to do. But if any of the dice are less than 4, they get complications, which is something that a lot of systems do, but it's very core to the way Volition works. Because, especially when you're in encounters with NPCs, the GM can kind of narrate what the NPCs are doing, but when it comes to like damaging players or using special abilities, NPCs don't take turns. They just do it as part of a complication. So if I'm a player and I roll to attack somebody and I get a success with one complication, then the GM gets to pick one of their NPCs to take a turn, essentially. And then the danger die, its size increases based on the level of the NPC or hazard rolling it. And the higher the roll of the danger die, the more extra complications get added. So that gives them a chance to take action. And it also means that if you fight higher level NPCs as a lower level player, they're going to be rolling lots of complications against you.
Yeah, I can get that. Now, with that in mind, because there's quite a few talents,
Mm-hmm.
how do you handle the risk of analysis paralysis, essentially?
Yeah, so that was definitely an early piece of feedback I got from people that I was showing the game to the first time, and I'm like, all right, I need to solve for this. So there's a couple things I've done. So first off, I try to make all the talents very distinct and kind of clear what they're for. Like one thing that I tried to do with this designing the system is it kind of frustrates me. And for example, in D&D, a new player might say, "Hey, I want to make somebody who like messes with minds using magic or something." And then it's like, okay, do you want to be a enchantment wizard or a Fey Pact warlock or a psychic sorcerer? Like, there's all these different things with different names, and mechanically they're very different from each other, but they're all sort of telling the same narrative with subtle differences. But in Volition, there's the enchantment talent. That's the one way to do mind magic that like affects other people in that kind of way, and it doesn't matter. But other talents can define like how you where your magic comes from or stuff like that. So that's one thing I did. Then I created something called archetypes, which kind of fill the same role as classes in other games, but they're just for when you make a character to start off.
Mm-hmm.
And archetypes are just groups of 4 talents. So for example, the wizard archetype gets the arcana, ice manipulation, electricity manipulation, and wording talents. But you don't have to start with an archetype. If you have a very specific character in mind, you can pick whatever 4 talents you want to start. And then even if you do pick, say, a wizard, whenever you start earning more talents, you then pick from all of them. Or you can, in character creation, start with a wizard, but then swap out 1 or 2 talents. Mm-hmm. So those archetypes are a place for people who don't have a specific character concept in mind yet, or something complicated they're trying to build. They just want to kind of get a feel for the system. And then another thing that I have planned that I haven't yet implemented into the website, but I'm going to hopefully sometime this year, is a way for GMs to create worlds in the website. And the world in the system is basically a collection of parts of the system that the players are allowed to use. So if you want to run, like a low fantasy game using Volition, mm-hmm. and magic is not accessible, or maybe there's 1 or 2 types of magic that are common, but the rest are really rare, and you have no, hacking or cybernetics or anything like that, you would create a world on the website, and then you would select which talents are part of the world and which ones aren't. And then when you go to invite their players and they start to make their characters, they wouldn't even see those talents that don't fit your world. Mm-hmm. So it's a way for GMs to kind of communicate to players what kind of story they're going for, what fits in their narrative, in a way that like doesn't kind of require extra communication outside of the game, and the players don't have to worry about skimming through all those talents, or they see a talent, they get excited, and the GM is like, well, actually that doesn't really fit my world, and then they have to go redo their whole character or anything like that.
Mm-hmm. Which I can certainly get that. And I think one of the other things I want to get into is the fact that instead of using some sort of XP to level up thing, you have experiences as a means to level up. But are those meant to be suggestions, or is there something else to it?
Yeah. So the every talent levels up independently, and you do that by performing experiences. And so so for example, I have a character that I'm playing in a game right now who has the Juggernaut talent, which basically represents like someone who wears heavy armor. And when I started at level 1 Juggernaut, there are 4 different ways I could gain experience. I could use one of the 2 level 1 features, because something I really wanted to emphasize with Volition is that it's cool when people use their abilities, and so you actually gain experience for using your abilities. And so that's one way to get experience. And then the other one is every talent has 2 unique experiences that you can do. So for Juggernaut, the 2 experiences are you take damage equal to or greater than your Juggernaut level, and the armor reduces that damage by at least 1. So that's kind of like using your armor that's granted to you by the talent to reduce damage. And then the other one is you suffer damage when another character might have taken that damage instead, which is a little bit more narrative to emphasize that idea of like you're wearing heavy armor to like protect yourself and protect others. And these experiences are there to encourage players to get into the role play of like what the talent means, and think about it more than just like, oh, I'm picking this talent because it's the best damage. It's like, no, you're picking the talent because it's telling everyone else at the table something about who your character is and what they do. Or like another good example is there's the Battle Frenzy talent, which kind of works like a rage mechanic in combat, but it gets experience when you defeat an NPC that's bigger than you who damaged you during a fight. So that kind of encourages that kind of character to search out NPCs that are big and tough and scary to fight, because they're not afraid of them.
Right, I can get that. And is this a case where characters and NPCs are made using the same parameters?
Not at all. So talents are pretty much the whole system. Everything is either written for players or for NPCs, and there's very few things that apply to both the same way. So players start as 4 talents and maybe some hereditary features if they're a special, species. But NPCs are made of different stuff. They have what are called classes. And an NPC class is basically just a list of complications that I kind of talked about before to pick from. So all of the NPC stats, like their health, the damage they deal on a hit, stuff like that, that comes from their level, which is independent from their classes. So you can have a level 1 dragon or a level 5 dragon, and that would be represented by like the flyer and fire manipulation NPC classes. Then the NPCs also get personalities, and that gives them a couple things to help the GM roleplay them. So that does add some additional complications, usually geared more towards social scenarios, as well as a desire that if the narrator's kind of struggling to think about what should this NPC do in this moment, they can look at that desire as a kind of guidepost. And by giving lots of different NPCs different personalities, it helps make the world feel more realistic and treat them more like people rather than just like a bunch of enemies to kill and move on to the next scene.
Yeah, which for me it's less on that and more on. I've seen a lot of Universalist games, especially back in the 2000s, that had it where player creation and NPC creation were exactly the same, and that ends up actually creating more problems than it solves. A lot of people, I think, got snowed on the idea that in doing so you'd have a level playing field. But given how in-depth character creation is, you're just putting more work on the GM, who's already going to be working himself to the bone as is.
exactly.
Uh,
Yeah, because the website has a fully functional character builder and character sheet that manages all the stuff for players. But there's also what I call the story screen, um, where you can create different scenes, and then each scene create these NPCs. And so it's really just a matter of picking these items from the list, and you can just say, "Oh, I want to make I have an enemy knight, so they're going to get the commander and defender NPC classes."
mhm.
And then you just click add class on both of those, and then once you save that NPC, you get a single list of all the complications from both those classes. So when this knight is in combat and the player rolls a complication, you just have one place you look at to see all the things the knight can do and then choose from them.
Yeah.
And then there's also in the website, if you're really in a rush and need to throw an encounter together, there's a quick NPC page where you just pick one class, and then based on the class, it picks a personality and a few other details for you. So you just, with 2 clicks, you can have a complete NPC ready to go.
So so you have those moments where you can pull something out of your ass and try and convince the players that you had this planned all along.
Yeah, like if all of a sudden they decide to. I actually had this happen in one of my Dungeons and Dragons games, where a player pulled out an item that I had forgotten I gave them that let them teleport the whole party to the Feywild to get out of a combat they were losing. And I'm like, oh, if I had been playing Volition, you can just go to quick NPC and then select fairy, and you have a complete fairy NPC ready to go.
Yeah.
That would have been great to greet them when they arrive there, for example.
Yeah. Now, speaking of magic, this is another one of those elephants in the room. I already talked about the cyberpunk one. Now I got to talk about this one, because obviously, magic is one of those things that if you're running fantasy, you kind of have to address in some form. Even if you're not using magic, you do have to answer the question. And some games are more infamous than others for how they treat magic versus treat everybody else. Looking at you, D&D. I'm looking at you with a death glare for my eternal hatred of the Vancian model. But would it be the case where magic is just treated as another form of talent? You're not doing some limited resource that they have to contend with?
Yeah, so I definitely felt the same way about D&D's magic. And, I look at TV shows and movies and books, and when they have a really cool wizard character or somebody who knows really interesting magic, some stories don't do it better than others, but typically they just get to do the cool thing, and they go into a battle and they are throwing blasts of fire at people, and they're not worrying about how many times they can do that per day. And also I really don't like the thing that I see happen sometimes in games where players have a cool ability that they're really excited to use, but they only get to use it once a day or once a rest or whatever. And they save it, and then they save it, and then they never actually get to use it.
The rainy day paradox.
Exactly. So a lot of throughout all of Volition, I designed it to where the intention is you're doing your cool stuff as much as possible, because why did you pick lightning manipulation if you're not going to be throwing lightning at people? So there are kind of 2 types of talents related to magic. There are magic sources and then schools of magic. So magic sources kind of define where does your magic come from, and they all in different ways make your magic better, but don't give you magic on its own. So, for example, the alchemy talent lets you create potions that mimic the spells and powers that you get from other schools. There's Arcana, where if you have some time to prepare, you can write an incantation about a spell, and that makes it so the next time you cast that spell, you get an advantage, so your fortune die is a little bit bigger. And then there's naturalism, which is where your magic comes from, the natural world and the environment. And in that case, you can attune to a certain ecosystem. and while you're attuned to that ecosystem, spells you cast related to it are better. So if you're like in a jungle, your spells related to interacting with that jungle will be better. But then if you then travel to like a volcano area, you need to attune to that environment, and now like you might be able to do fire magic better if you have that. So those are the magic sources, and then the schools of magic are where you actually get the spells, which in Volition are called powers, which I'll get into why in a second. So the schools of magic follow a few patterns. At every level, they give you one power and then one other ability. So, for example, fire manipulation is a school of magic. And at level 1, you get a power that causes a character to start burning, which is a 1 damage per turn condition. And then their other one is that you can produce a small harmless flame that provides light and heat. And so those powers are kind of like something you have to roll to activate. But there's no limit to how often you can use them. And then as you level up, you get more and more powerful powers, but it's never the case where a power is strictly better than an earlier one. There are plenty of times where at a higher level, you'll get a special ability that makes an earlier level power better. But the idea is that all of your powers are at least somewhat useful through the entirety of the game. So it's as you level up, it's more about different ways to use your magic rather than just, oh, I do this spell does this damage, and the higher level spell is the same thing but more damage or anything like that. I'm avoiding all that.
Yeah.
But yeah, and I've been playing a campaign with a couple of spellcasters, and it's been working pretty well where they don't have to worry about resources or anything complicated. They just like, oh, like somebody has the shadow manipulation talent, and they're like, oh, we want to sneak across this hallway. I'll just create an area of darkness, which is exactly what the that power lets you do. But one other advantage with all of the schools of magic being talents is that you can roll them as like a skill check might work in any other system. So if you want to do something with your fire magic or time magic or telekinesis or whatever, but it's not exactly spelled out in the rules, the GM can just have you make a roll to try to do that, and it follows the same rules as, you know, if you wanted to do an athletics roll or a diplomacy roll or anything like that, and you have the appropriate talent for that kind of skill.
Yeah, I can get that. Now, given that, one of the things that I did see when I messed around with the character creator is, unless I missed something, there didn't seem to be a way to have a character who's starting at a higher floor, which is something that gets brought up. You know, playing characters starting above level 1 or something like that. Is that something you plan on adding into the site in the future?
Yeah, so as I build out the world system that I mentioned earlier, I'm going to include in that more tools for GMs to kind of customize like what is the starting basis for a campaign going to look like, and what kind of settings do they want to apply to their players. Like, for example, I plan pretty soon on adding like safety tools in on that, where the GM can customize different types of safety tools for the website to handle, and then the players will see that when they create their character and specify different like lines and veils and things like that.
Would that same setup also allow for like a quick way for the players to know what talents would be off the table?
Yeah, that's kind of the primary purpose of the world system, is to allow the GM to customize what parts of the system the players have access to. But there's a lot of room for other stuff in there, like you were saying, starting at higher levels. And I mean, the way I would do that now is I would just make a standard character, and then once you get to the character sheet screen, there's a little yellow gear in the top right, and in that menu there's a tab called Tweak Character, which is kind of where you can break the rules of the game And that lets you like advance your talents without having experience, or add new hereditary features, or even tweak your health or stuff like that. So if you rescue a priest and then you get a boon from a god, that menu is kind of a way for the GM to do things that the website doesn't allow for naturally, or the rules. And so starting at higher level was something you could definitely do that way. But especially in systems like this where there's not a single character level, but like multiple talent levels, it's a little bit tricky. And I have some guidelines on like if you're a player joining an existing campaign, how much you get to start at. Because if there are people that have like multiple level 3 talents, it would feel pretty bad, even if you're a new player, to have just the 4 level 1 talents and nothing else. So kind of the way I handled that, and this is not baked into the website yet, but it will be soon, is you pick another character in the campaign and you kind of copy their talent levels, but you get to pick your own talents in that regard.
Yeah, I can certainly get that. Now, with that in mind, one of the sayings that I have here in my monastery is, "No one plays Uno as written." So with that in mind, how would you plan on handling things like homebrewing or things like custom rules? Is that something that you're going to be putting into that world designer add-on?
Absolutely. So if you want to, make your own talent or your own hereditary features or things like that, the world designer would be the perfect place for that kind of thing. And I've done my best to try to cover everything I can with my talents, but also I want to give DMs the flexibility to kind of make it their own, since this is a system designed for your own world. And because like a talent, like one thing I've noticed when people homebrew for other games is they make a lot of things as, say, spells that don't really seem like they should be spells. It's just because spells, because they're such like a modular design, are the easiest thing to homebrew into rather than doing a full class or whatever. But talents have a pretty standard structure, and they can be almost anything. So that's a great place for people to like homebrew whatever kind of stuff they want to put into their game.
And speaking of complications, that's one of those things I definitely knew I wanted to touch on. Because of the fact that when it comes to those sort of narrative tags, a lot of games that include them, including things like my Eternal Whipping Boy Fate, suffer from a lack of guidance, where they give you a broad description about what a complication is, but don't really extrapolate on what the line is between what would be too easy of a complication, what might be too harsh, for example. And within Volition, do you plan on putting in some guide, or if you haven't already, put in some guidance on that kind of thing?
Yeah, so that's definitely in there already. So in that story screen that I mentioned, which is basically the narrator's view while playing the game, they see a couple different things. So the first thing it's kind of broken into different cards on the screen, which is kind of like a UI term. But so there's a card labeled Common Rules, and that has a list of common complications. And so that's stuff that basically, no matter the scenario, you can pick something from this list, and it'll kind of make sense as a complication to apply when you need it. So there's things like a hero takes damage, a hostile NPC enters the scene, a hero loses some of their supply, an NPC asks the party to provide a favor, or a hero becomes weakened, or things like that. Then they have a card for each player, and besides talents, one of the only other things you have to pick for your character is a flaw. And a flaw gives you additional experience, is like we talked about before. But if you fulfill the experiences of your flaw, you can put those points into any talent rather than a specific one. But the other thing the flaw gives are some complications for the narrator to use. So, for example, in a one-shot I ran, there was a player with the angry flaw. So, in my GM view, under that player, I see the complications. Something drives this hero beyond the snapping point and they become furious, which is a condition that gives them disadvantage on any rolls not related to satisfying their anger. But once that anger is satisfied, that condition ends. And then the other complication is the anger drives them to act rashly without concern or consequences. On their next roll, they suffer 2 additional complications. And there's all sorts of different flaws to pick from with different sets of complications. And those are also usually pretty good for like social scenarios or when a player is kind of like making a roll, but there's not any immediate threat, but complications come up. And then another type of card you can have in a scene is for NPCs, and they have a whole list of complications from their classes and their personality. So you can pick from those. And with all the complications, I try to make it narrative, but also very specific about what's happening. So, like, for example, the engineer NPC class has a complication where it can decrease the character's armor by tinkering with it. There's one where they disable a piece of technology, or one where they enhance a piece of technology, which causes it to deal additional damage if they activate it. And then there's another thing I have in Volition that you can create as cards called hazards. And kind of like NPCs, hazards are just collections of complications, but they're more about the environment or natural kind of effects where they don't have like health or hit points or a personality. So, for example, if you're doing, a battle near a cliffside, there's a chasm hazard, and and this also kind of gets back to the idea I talked about earlier of putting subsystems into parts of the game rather than it's in the main rules. So, like, the chasm hazard has a couple complications. One of them is that a character close to the edge stumbles and begins teetering, which is a condition. And then there's another complication where if somebody's teetering, they slip and begin hanging. And then the third complication is a hanging character loses their grip and plummets into the chasm. So having those as 3 kind of steps to falling into the chasm is a way to kind of tell GMs, like, hey, you don't want to just, as a single complication, have someone fall off the cliff and die from a huge drop. That's not fun. But having 3 successive complications gives the players chances to react and deal with the situation before it becomes a death. And so that's not like a subsystem, but it's like built into this hazard in a way where you don't have to worry about it until you add this to your scene, and then you can read how it works right then and there rather than having to go look up in the rule book somewhere to see where this sort of thing's handled.
I can get that. So, with that in mind, do you have any plans in the future to integrate Volition into virtual tabletops like, say, Roll20 or Foundry?
Yeah, so I've thought about that, and the website definitely puts it in a good position for that. Pretty much all of the Volition I've run or played in has been theater of the mind, and having the website to use to reference and keep track of health and stuff does a lot of the job of what a VTT does. But I am planning in the next month or 2 to run some playtests using grids and like dungeon maps and things like that, just to see how the system feels with that kind of thing. But also like and that would make like a VTT work very well. But more and more I'm adding features to the website that a VTT would add. A couple months ago added like digital dice rolling, so you can roll dice directly on the website, and they are 3D animated, and they have custom icons to represent the different results. So it kind of fits in with the system. And eventually I'm going to add things like a chat box to send messages, even though I'm kind of like, because I play a lot on VTTs with other systems, and sometimes we'll be talking over a microphone, but then somebody will like say, "Oh, my character goes and investigates this thing," like in the chat, so they don't interrupt the current conversation. So something like that, I could add to this website at some point. But just depending on how things go, I think a VTT integration could work pretty well because all the data of the game is in a format that the VTT would need already. And especially with customizable ones like Foundry is the one I'm most familiar with. It seems pretty clear to me how I would set it up to where I could have Foundry pull data from the Volition website in real time and keep things updated in that way.
Yeah, I could certainly get that. But with that said, I'll certainly be looking forward to seeing how Volition develops. And I do want to sincerely thank you for taking the time out of your schedule to come all the way to my temple and enjoy the madness that happens here.
Yeah, I really appreciate you inviting me to be here, getting a chance to talk about this thing I've been working on for so long. And even if it gets one more person, if one more person has a good time getting to play Volition, it'll be worth it. Because like I said, I'm not interested in making $1 million with it or anything like that. Just looking to help people tell the stories that they want to tell without having to deal with complicated systems or software or finding information about stuff that they're not excited about, and focus on what really matters, which is telling cool stories with your friends.
Which is all fair and good. And with that said, anytime you see fit to return to the temple, the door is always open. As I often say around here, drinking is not mandatory, but it is encouraged. And of course, a sincere thanks goes out to everyone who took the time out of their schedule to come onto the show and enjoy the madness. And there'll be plenty more where that came from, as there always is here, on the open bar of the internet. But until then, on behalf of the good brothers present and not present, my name is Mildra, I am your gaming monk. Stay fucking frosty, everybody!
감사해요. 心 听。